The coldest moment of my life wasn't in the dead of winter. It was on a perfectly manicured front porch, under a warm afternoon sun, watching a heavy oak door click shut. That sound, that final, definitive click of the deadbolt, it's a sound that will be etched into my memory forever. It was the sound of my childhood ending for the second time. It was the sound of my own children's hearts breaking. My parents told me their house was a sanctuary for their real family as they pushed my sobbing children out onto the porch ahead of me. My father, with his jaw set and his eyes as hard as river stones, stood there like a sentinel guarding a fortress. And my mother, her face a mask of pinched disappointment, simply turned her back. They thought they were cutting me out. They thought they were excising the part of the family that didn't fit their perfect picture. They had no idea, not a single clue, that they were standing in my house when they did it. And I was about to remind them, you see, that house, that sprawling, two-story monument to suburban perfection, it wasn't just their home. It was their kingdom. Every blade of grass on the lawn was meticulously aligned, a green velvet carpet that was only ever meant to be admired, never played on. The windows were so clean they were practically invisible, polished to a shine that reflected their own perfect image back at them. Inside, the air was still and sterile, smelling faintly of lemon polish and quiet resentment. It was a house built not for comfort, but for display. It was a museum of a family, and my children and I were the exhibits that were always kept in storage. They were so busy polishing their crowns, they never bothered to check who actually owned the throne. For years, I had watched them operate. I was the B-stock investment, the dutiful daughter who chose a life of service over a life of status. My brother, he was the blue chip. He gave them a grandchild who fit their narrative, a polished, perfect little prodigy we'll call the golden grandchild. And for this grandchild, they built a shrine. An entire bedroom on the second floor was converted into a palace. A custom-built bed, shelves lined with pristine, unread classic books, and a wall that was a gallery of every minor achievement, every crayon drawing, every school photo, all professionally framed in mahogany and gold. It looked like a catalog for a child who didn't actually exist. Meanwhile, my children, my beautiful, chaotic, loving children, they got the basement. They got the lumpy, pull-out sofa that smelled of mothballs and neglect. Their artwork, vibrant and full of life, was lucky to get a corner of the fridge, held up by a weak, promotional magnet before it would mysteriously get lost during one of my mother's cleaning sprees. I swallowed it all. For years, I swallowed the 1,000 tiny cuts, the backhanded compliments about my career, the passive-aggressive comments about my children's volume, the blatant, shameless favoritism that dripped from their every word. I did it because I believed foolishly that my children deserved grandparents, even fractured ones. But standing on that porch with my 15-year-old shoulders shaking in silent sobs and my 11-year-old burying her tear-streaked face in my side, the part of me that craved their approval, the part that hoped they would one day see us, it shriveled up and died right there on those cold, concrete steps. And in its place, something new and hard and sharp began to grow. They had forgotten the most important rule of power. It's not about who lives in the castle, it's about who holds the deed. And that deed, that single, life-altering piece of paper, was sitting in a dusty lockbox in my closet, waiting for this exact moment. This isn't just a story about being kicked out. This is the story of how I dismantled their perfect, hollow world brick by brick. This is the story of how I took back my power, my children's dignity, and the roof over my parents' heads. It's a wild ride, so do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe right now, because you're not going to want to miss a single, satisfying second of this. But that final, brutal act on the porch, it wasn't a lightning strike from a clear blue sky. No, it was the flood that finally broke the dam after a lifetime of slow, steady rain. It was the culmination of 1,000 cuts, 1,000 moments of being weighed, measured, and found wanting. To understand the ice in my veins on that day, you have to understand the slow poisoning that came before it. You have to understand the birthdays, the holidays, the moments of crisis where the true nature of my family was laid bare. It started with the birthdays, or rather, the tale of two birthdays, which happened every single year, just 1 month apart. First was the coronation of the golden grandchild. My parents' house would transform. A bouncy castle would magically inflate on the sacrosanct lawn. Caterers with crisp white aprons would glide through the house, carrying silver platters of miniature quiches and artisanal sandwiches with the crusts cut off. A professional entertainer, usually a magician or a scientist with bubbling beakers, would perform in the living room. It was less a child's birthday party and more a networking event for my parents to show off their prized investment. I remember last year's spectacle vividly. My brother and his wife stood beaming while my father gave a toast, champagne flute in hand. He spoke of legacy, of potential, of the bright future of the family, as he gestured to his golden grandchild, who was busy unwrapping a custom-built, top-of-the-line gaming PC that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. That was after the personalized riding lessons and the full professional equestrian kit. The pile of gifts looked like a department store display, a mountain of cellophane and glossy boxes. My children sat on the edge of the crowd, quietly eating their single slice of professionally made cake, looking like two little ghosts at a feast. Then, a month later, it would be my son's birthday. The contrast was a physical blow. We'd have it at our small, cozy house. I'd order a few pizzas, hang up some streamers myself, and invite a handful of his school friends. My parents would always arrive exactly 1 hour late, just as the party was winding down. They'd walk in, my mother subtly wiping her feet on the doormat for just a second too long, her eyes scanning our living room with an expression that was a perfect blend of pity and distaste. Last year, they handed my son a thin, generic envelope. He opened it to find a $20 gift card to a bookstore. My father clapped him on the shoulder and said, "There you go, champ. Reading is fundamental." Then, my mother pulled me aside into the kitchen. Her voice was a low, conspiratorial whisper. "You know," she began, rearranging a stack of my clean plates, "we just feel it's so important not to spoil children. It builds character when they understand the value of money. Your brother is a bit extravagant. We're trying to provide some balance." The hypocrisy was so staggering it almost took my breath away. She was lecturing me on financial responsibility while the receipt for a 4-figure gaming PC was probably still in her purse. My son, who was old enough to understand everything, just gave me a small, sad smile from across the room and whispered, "It's okay, Mom." But it wasn't okay. It was the slow, methodical erosion of my children's worth in the eyes of their own family. And then came the holidays, the holiday humiliation, as I called it. Christmas dinner at their house was a command performance. The table was set with the good china, so ornate and delicate you were afraid to breathe on it. The conversation was a carefully orchestrated performance, and my father was the conductor. He would go around the table, asking everyone what they'd been up to. When he got to my brother, he'd lean forward, his eyes gleaming. He'd listen intently as my brother talked about stock portfolios, corporate restructuring, and exotic business trips. Then he'd turn to the golden grandchild and ask about their fencing tournaments, their debate club victories, their cello recitals. Every achievement was met with booming praise and applause. Then the spotlight would swing to my side of the table. The air would change. My father's eyes would glaze over with a polite, vacant interest. My daughter would start to talk excitedly about the lead role she got in the school play, and my father would nod and say, "Oh, that's nice, dear. A little hobby is good for keeping busy." A hobby, my daughter's passion, dismissed as a triviality. My son would mention the computer program he was learning to code, and my grandfather would chuckle. "Still messing around with those computer games, are we? Your cousin is learning to manage a real-world investment portfolio. Maybe you should take a page from his book." The final act of the night was always my father's toast. He'd raise his glass of expensive wine and say something like, "To a wonderful year," to my son, for his continued success in the world of finance, and to my brilliant grandchild for making us proud every single day. He would pause, then turn his gaze on me, his expression softening into one of condescending pity. And to my daughter and her children for reminding us of the simpler things in life. And everyone would drink to that, to us being the simple ones, the court jesters in their royal court. I would sit there, clenching my fork under the table until my knuckles were white, a plastic smile cemented on my face, feeling the walls of that perfect dining room closing in on me. But the moment, the single defining incident that should have been my last straw long before that day on the porch, was the health scare. My youngest came down with a fever one night. It wasn't a small one. It was a terrifying climb-the-walls, 104-degree fever. She was delirious. I was a single mom, alone and terrified. After a call with the on-call pediatrician at 2 a.m., I was told to take her to the emergency room immediately. My son was asleep upstairs, and I couldn't leave him alone. My hands were shaking as I called my mother. I just needed anyone to come and sit in my house for a few hours so I could take my daughter to the hospital. I can still hear the sound of her voice on the other end of the line, thick with sleep and annoyance. I explained the situation, my voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. There was a long pause. "Oh, honey," she finally said, her voice completely devoid of warmth. "That sounds awful. But I can't possibly come over now. Your father has his big golf tournament in the morning, and he needs his rest. And you know how I am with germs. My immune system is just so fragile." I begged her. I told her she wouldn't even have to see my daughter. Just be in the house while my son slept. "It's just not a good time," she repeated, her voice turning cold and final. Then she delivered the killing blow. "Honestly, when your nephew had that little sniffle last month, your brother and his wife were so worried. We dropped everything and rushed right over with soup. But this sounds very messy. You're a nurse. You know what you're doing. You'll handle it. You always do." And then she hung up. I sat there in the dark, holding my feverish child, the dial tone buzzing in my ear. I had never felt so utterly, completely alone. She was right. I would handle it. I always did. I ended up having to wake my sleeping son, bundle them both into the car, and sit with him in the hospital waiting room for 6 hours while my daughter was being treated. That was the night I understood that to my parents, my brother's family was a precious vase to be protected, and my family was a set of sturdy, unbreakable dishes, meant to be used, stacked, and forgotten. We were only valued for our resilience, for our ability to withstand their neglect. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Like you were just a supporting character in someone else's story? Let me know in the comments below, because I know I can't be the only one who has ever felt like that. Every story of revenge has a breaking point, a moment so sharp, so brutally clear, that it severs the past from the future. For me, that moment arrived on a Tuesday. I remember the oppressive, humming silence of the hospital ward at the end of a 16-hour double shift. Every part of me ached with a deep, cellular exhaustion. My feet were swollen, my back was a knot of fire, and my brain felt like it was wrapped in cotton wool. All I could think about was getting home to my kids, collapsing into my own bed, and sleeping for a week. That's when my phone buzzed. A message from the head nurse. A sudden staffing emergency meant they needed me back in 6 hours for another full shift. It was a request, but it wasn't really a request. In my line of work, you don't say no. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the fog of my exhaustion. I had no one. No friends who could come over at 4 a.m. No neighbors I could ask to take on that kind of burden. There was only one option. The option I always avoided until I was standing on the very edge of the cliff. I had to call my parents. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot, the steering wheel cool beneath my trembling hands, and I rehearsed the conversation in my head. I would be polite. I would be deferential. I would not let them hear the desperation in my voice. I dialed the number. My mother answered on the 4th ring, her voice laced with that familiar, long-suffering sigh, as if my call was a physical weight she had to lift. "Hello," she said, the single word dripping with impatience. I explained the situation as quickly and calmly as I could. The double shift, the emergency call-in, the utter lack of any other choice. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for an eternity. I could hear the faint sound of the television in the background, one of my father's stuffy historical dramas. "Well," she finally said, her voice dripping with condescension, "that is a terrible failure of planning on your part, isn't it? Your brother manages a multi-million-dollar hedge fund, and he never has scheduling conflicts." "Mom, please," I whispered, my professionalism cracking. "It's an emergency. I just need a place for them to sleep tonight. I'll pick them up the second I'm done." Another sigh, this one louder, more performative. "I suppose we can manage," she said, as if she were agreeing to perform open-heart surgery. "But you have to bring them over now, and tell them to be quiet. Your father is preparing for a very important presentation, and the golden grandchild is coming over early tomorrow. We can't have the house in a state of chaos." The relief I felt was so overwhelming it almost made me nauseous. I thanked her profusely, ignoring the backhanded insults, and drove home. I woke my sleeping children, my heart aching as I explained they had to go to Grandma and Grandpa's. They were old enough to understand. I saw the familiar look in their eyes, a mixture of resignation and anxiety. They knew the rules of that house as well as I did. Be quiet, be clean, be invisible. I dropped them off with a kiss and a promise to be back as soon as I could. I watched them walk up that perfectly paved walkway and disappear into the house. And then I went back to work, running on fumes and caffeine, my mind a million miles away, praying for the night to pass without incident. My prayer went unanswered. The call came just as I was finishing my shift, just as a sliver of dawn was breaking the horizon. It was my mother, and she was shrieking. The sound was so shrill, so full of hysterical rage, that I thought someone must be dying. "You have to come here, right now. I can't believe this. I simply cannot believe the absolute lack of respect. Mom, what is it? What's wrong? Are the kids okay?" "Okay. They're not okay. They are destructive. They have ruined it. The new beige carpeting. Your father and I spent a fortune on it. There is a red stain. Your brother's child would never dream of being so clumsy, so utterly thoughtless." Through the phone, I could hear my daughter's terrified sobs in the background. My blood ran cold. "What happened, Mom?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "What happened is that your children were running in the living room, a place for quiet contemplation, and they spilled a glass of fruit punch. This is what happens when there is no discipline at home. This is why we can't have nice things. This house is a sanctuary of peace and order, not a playground for unruly children." I hung up the phone. I didn't say another word. I walked out of the hospital, ignoring the calls of my colleagues, and got in my car. The drive to my parents' house was a blur. The streets were empty in the early morning light, but in my mind a siren was screaming. Every condescending comment, every dismissive wave of the hand, every passive-aggressive lecture from the last 30 years was swirling in my head, a tornado of resentment and rage. When I pulled up, the scene that greeted me was worse than anything I could have imagined. It was a tableau of pure, calculated humiliation. My children, my 15-year-old son and my 11-year-old daughter, were sitting on the front steps. Their little backpacks were on the pavement next to them, packed and zipped, as if they were being evicted. My father was standing in the open doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of granite. He wasn't their grandfather. He was a bouncer, a gatekeeper, and my children had just been thrown out of the club. I got out of the car, my legs unsteady, and walked towards them. My son looked up at me, his face pale, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears of shame. My daughter refused to look at me at all, keeping her face buried in her knees. "What is this?" I asked, my voice a low tremor. My father looked at me, but it was like he was looking at a stranger. There was no recognition, no empathy, no love. "We've made a decision," he said, his voice cold and flat, each word a perfectly polished stone of cruelty. "This is not a good environment for them here. They don't fit. They don't respect the rules." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, then delivered the final, devastating blow. "We're focusing our energy on our grandchild who appreciates what we provide, the one who adds value to this family. It's best if you don't bring your children back here anymore. This is a sanctuary for our real family." Our real family. The world went silent. The sound of the birds in the meticulously pruned trees, the distant hum of traffic, it all faded away. The only thing I could hear was a high-pitched ringing in my ears. He had drawn a line in the sand, and my children and I were on the wrong side of it. We were the outcasts, the disposable ones. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I was hollowed out, a walking shell of shock and a white-hot, silent rage that was so immense it felt like it could power a star. I simply nodded a single, sharp movement of my head. I took my children by the hand, their small hands cold and trembling in mine. I picked up their backpacks and walked them back to my car. The ride home was conducted in absolute, deafening silence. I could see their reflections in the car windows, the tear tracks glistening on their cheeks in the morning sun. They didn't make a sound. They were in shock, trying to process a rejection so fundamental, so absolute, that it would change them forever. And as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, I felt the last vestiges of the dutiful daughter I used to be burn away, leaving behind something cold, something hard, and something utterly, completely unbreakable. They had made a mistake. They had pushed the wrong person to the breaking point. And in the silence of that car ride, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they were going to pay for it. The front door of my own home felt like a gateway to another world. We stepped out of the cold, sterile judgment of my parents' universe and into the warm, lived-in silence of ours. No one spoke. The air was thick with unspoken pain, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. My son, with a maturity that broke my heart, immediately went to the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water, handing one to his sister. He put his arm around her, and they just stood there in the entryway, 2 small soldiers returning from a battle they never should have had to fight. My body moved on autopilot, a machine programmed for comfort. I made them hot chocolate, the rich, sweet smell filling the kitchen. I watched them cup their hands around the warm mugs, their eyes vacant, staring at nothing. The questions I was dreading finally came, not in a rush, but in a quiet, broken whisper from my daughter. "Mom," she said, her voice small enough to fit in the palm of my hand. "Why don't they like us?" The simple, brutal honesty of it shattered the last of my composure. I pulled her into my arms, my son joining the embrace, and the 3 of us stood there, a tiny, heartbroken island in the middle of my kitchen. What do you say to that? How do you explain to your children that the love from their grandparents is a currency they were never meant to possess? "Oh, sweetie," I whispered into her hair, my own voice thick with unshed tears. "This has nothing to do with you. Nothing. You are both the most wonderful, brilliant, and kind people I know. This is about them. It's a brokenness inside of them, not you." Later, as I tucked them into bed, the real devastation was in their silence. The usual bedtime chatter, the requests for one more story, the silly jokes, it was all gone, replaced by a heavy, wounded stillness. I sat on the edge of my daughter's bed and wiped a stray tear from her cheek with my thumb. "We're not going back there, are we?" she asked, her eyes pleading with me. "No," I said, the word tasting like freedom and iron. "No, baby, we are never going back there." I stayed with them for over an hour, sitting on the floor in the hallway between their rooms, long after their breathing had evened out into the uneasy sleep of the emotionally wounded. I just sat there in the dark, guarding their rest, while the storm that had been gathering inside me for 30 years finally broke. The first wave was grief. It was a physical, gut-wrenching thing, a 30-year-old dam of disappointment and hope finally cracking and giving way. I wept without making a sound, the tears carving hot tracks down my face in the darkness. I wasn't just crying for my children. I was crying for the little girl inside me who had spent her entire life trying to be good enough, smart enough, quiet enough for two people who were incapable of seeing her. I cried for the birthdays where I'd hoped for a sign of genuine affection, for the holidays where I'd prayed for a moment of sincere praise. Every ignored phone call, every backhanded compliment, every dismissive sigh, it all came rushing back, a tidal wave of quiet sorrows. I was grieving the death of a fantasy, the fantasy that one day, if I just tried hard enough, my parents would finally love me unconditionally. But as the grief washed over me, it left something else in its wake. Something hot and sharp and ugly. The sadness began to curdle, thickening into a rage so pure and so potent it felt like it could burn the house down. The image of my father's face, cold and righteous in the doorway, flashed in my mind. The sound of my mother's shrieking voice on the phone, accusing my children of being destructive. The condescending toast at Christmas. The cruel, dismissive words during my daughter's health scare. It was a fool's errand. The thought landed in my mind with the force of a physical blow. The entire 30-year project of my life, seeking their approval, had been a complete and utter fool's errand. It was like trying to draw water from a dry well. It was like begging for warmth from a block of ice. Their love wasn't something to be earned. It was a tool to be used. A weapon for control, a reward given only to those who reflected their own narcissism back at them. And we, my children and I, were a broken mirror. We reflected a truth they didn't want to see, a life built on compassion instead of status, on creativity instead of currency, on a quiet, resilient love that they would never, ever understand. And in that moment of absolute clarity, the rage began to cool. The fiery, chaotic anger that had been consuming me started to crystallize. The heat dissipated, and what was left behind was ice. It was a cold, hard, and perfectly clear resolve. The pain was still there, a deep, throbbing ache beneath the surface, but it was no longer my master. It was now my fuel. The goal was no longer to win their love. The goal was no longer to survive their judgment. The new goal, the only goal, was justice. Not loud, screaming, messy justice, but a cold, quiet, methodical justice. The kind of justice that is not only felt, but is also final. The part of me that had been a daughter, desperate for her parents' affection, died on the floor of that hallway. And the part of me that was a mother, a protector, a queen whose castle had been attacked, rose from the ashes. At that moment, something inside me snapped for good. The part of me that wanted their approval was finally gone. Before I tell you what I did next, I want to ask, what would you do in my shoes? Let me know your revenge plans in the comments. And if you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to the channel for more tales of justice. I rose from the floor of that hallway, my limbs stiff, my tear tracks cold on my cheeks. But the woman who stood up was not the same one who had collapsed there hours earlier. The grief had been a baptism, and the rage was a fire that had forged something new inside me. I walked through my quiet, sleeping house, not to the kitchen for a drink of water, not to my bedroom to collapse, but to the deep, forgotten corner of my closet. Behind a stack of old photo albums and a box of winter clothes was a small, heavy, fireproof lockbox. It was charcoal gray, unassuming, and covered in a fine layer of dust. The dust of years of patience, of years of misplaced hope. I hadn't opened it in almost a decade. I carried it to the kitchen table, the weight of it a familiar, grounding presence. The metallic click of the latches springing open echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. Inside, beneath my children's birth certificates and my own passport, was a thick, cream-colored file folder. My hands were perfectly steady as I lifted it out. There was no dramatic fanfare, no sudden revelation. This wasn't a secret I had just discovered. It was a secret I had been keeping, a promise I had been honoring. It was a weapon I had prayed I would never have to use. I opened the folder. There it was, lying dormant under a set of legal instructions. The official deed to the house at 128 Maple Lane. The sprawling, two-story monument to suburban perfection. The kingdom my parents believed was theirs. And right there, under the heading Registered Owner, was my name, printed in stark, unforgiving black ink. Holding that paper, the world fell away, and I was transported back 10 years to a quiet, sun-drenched room that smelled of antiseptic and roses. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was propped up on a mountain of pillows. She was a woman made of porcelain and steel. While my parents were obsessed with the glossy exterior of life, my grandmother was a student of its messy, complicated, and beautiful interior. She saw everything. She saw everyone. And she saw right through her own daughter and son-in-law. I was sitting by her bedside, holding her frail, bird-like hand. Her eyes, though clouded with age and illness, were as sharp and clear as they had ever been. "They're fools, you know," she had whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. I knew exactly who they were. "Grandma, don't," I'd said softly. "No, you listen to me now," she insisted, her grip on my hand surprisingly strong. "They are fools wrapped in arrogance. They think this big, fancy house makes them royalty. They think your brother's salary makes them successful. They are like magpies, my dear, distracted by the shiniest trinkets, and they will peck away at anything, and anyone who doesn't glitter." She had paused, taking a rattling breath. "I have watched them my whole life. I watched them with you and your brother. Their love is not a blanket that warms. It is a spotlight, and they only shine it on the performer who gets the loudest applause. And that will never be you, child. Not because you are not worthy, but because your light is a quiet, steady flame, and they are blind to anything that is not a firework." She had gestured with her head towards a briefcase on the chair in the corner. "My lawyer brought me some papers today. When I'm gone, your mother will get my jewelry. She will like that. It glitters. But you, I have given you the foundation. I have paid off the mortgage on that house, and I have put the deed entirely in your name." I had stared at her, my mind unable to process the words. "What? Grandma, why? You can't." "I can," she said, her eyes boring into mine, filled with a fierce, protective love. "And I have. This is not a gift, do you understand me? A gift can be refused. This is a fail-safe. It is a shield for you and for the children you will one day have. They will live in that house, feeling like kings, but you will hold the key to the kingdom. You will let them live there. You will be a good daughter, and you will say nothing. Because I know you. You will hope they will change. You will give them 1,000 chances they do not deserve." Her voice had dropped lower, filled with a chilling certainty. "But a day will come when they will push you too far. They will mistake your kindness for weakness. They will hurt you in a way that is unforgivable, likely through your children, because that is where you are most vulnerable. They will draw a line so deep and so dark that you can no longer see the other side. And on that day, this deed stops being a shield." Her grip tightened on my hand, her knuckles white. "On that day, it becomes a sword. And you must promise me, you must promise your old, dying grandmother, that when that day comes, you will not hesitate to use it." I had made that promise, my voice choked with tears, not truly believing that day would ever come. I had taken the deed, locked it away, and spent the next 10 years trying to prove my wise grandmother wrong. I had swallowed the insults, endured the neglect, and absorbed the 1,000 cuts, all in the vain hope that my parents' love was not a spotlight, but a dormant seed that might one day finally grow. Sitting there at my kitchen table, the first rays of dawn painting the sky outside my window, I finally accepted the truth. My grandmother had not been cynical. She had been a prophet. My parents had drawn their line. They had pushed me over the edge. They had hurt my children in the most fundamental way possible. And the shield I had been hiding behind for a decade now felt heavy in my hands. its edges sharp, its purpose clear. It felt like a sword, and I remembered the second part of my promise. I would not hesitate. The next morning, there was no trace of the grief-stricken woman who had collapsed in the hallway. I woke before the sun, my mind a landscape of cold, quiet clarity. I made my children their favorite breakfast, pancakes shaped like cartoon characters, a small act of normalcy in a world that had been fractured. I packed their lunches, making sure to include their favorite snacks. I helped my daughter with her hair and listened to my son talk about a project at school. In the simple, sacred rhythm of motherhood, I found my strength. This was my kingdom. This was the family I was fighting for. After I dropped them off at school, I didn't go to work. I drove downtown. The city was waking up, a bustling hive of purpose. And for the first time, I felt like I was a part of it, not just an observer. I didn't search for a family lawyer or a mediator. Those were tools for people who still had a family to salvage. I searched for the best, most ruthless real estate litigator in the city. I found his name on the top floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper that scraped the clouds. The law office of Mr. Davies was exactly what I expected. A world of cool gray tones, minimalist furniture, and hushed efficiency. It was a place where messy emotions were translated into the cold, hard language of contracts and consequences. Mr. Davies himself was a man in his 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than my car. He sat behind a desk of dark wood and smoked glass, a picture of professional detachment. He gestured for me to sit, folded his hands, and got straight to the point. "Good morning," he said, his voice smooth and neutral. My assistant said it was a time-sensitive property matter. What seems to be the issue? I didn't start with the story of the fruit punch or the birthday parties. I didn't speak of my children's tears. I had learned my lesson. In worlds like this, emotion was a weakness. Facts were power. I reached into my bag, pulled out the cream-colored file folder, and slid it across the vast, polished surface of his desk. "I am the sole legal and registered owner of the property at 128 Maple Lane," I said, my voice as steady and cool as the glass in front of me. "The current occupants are living there without a lease agreement or any legal standing. I need to begin the formal, legal eviction process immediately." He picked up the folder, his expression unchanging. He opened it and began to read, his eyes scanning the deed with the practiced speed of a man who had seen thousands of them. He hummed softly, a low, professional sound. "Well," he said, looking up for a moment, "this all seems to be in perfect order. The title is clean, transferred, and registered correctly 10 years ago. It's an open and shut case. We can have a notice drafted and served within 24 hours. Now, you said the current occupants are—" He paused, flipping back to his notes. "Your parents." He looked up from the paper, and for the first time, the professional mask slipped. The neutral curiosity in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of genuine shock. He looked at the deed, then at me, then back at the deed, as if trying to solve a complex equation that didn't add up. Most of the cases that crossed his desk were corporations fighting over zoning laws, or wealthy buyers disputing closing costs. This was different. "That's correct," I said. "My parents." He leaned back in his leather chair, the mask gone now, replaced by a deep, probing curiosity. "I see," he said slowly, though it was clear he didn't. "This is highly unusual. May I ask what led to this decision?" I met his gaze and held it. I gave him the truth, but not the whole, messy, 30-year truth. I gave him the lawyer's version, the cold, hard facts of the case. "Yesterday morning," I began, "after they had agreed to watch my 2 minor children, they threw my children out of the house and onto the front porch. They informed me that my children and I were no longer welcome, as the house was, and I quote, a sanctuary for their real family. Since my children are not welcome in the home, I see no reason to continue to provide that home to the occupants, rent-free." I watched his face as I spoke. The shock slowly melted away, replaced by a dawning understanding. His sharp, intelligent eyes narrowed slightly. A long moment of silence passed as he processed the sheer, calculated cruelty of it. And then I saw it. It wasn't a big, theatrical smile. It was a small, grim, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of his mouth. It was the smile of a chess master who has just seen his opponent walk into a perfectly laid, inescapable trap. It was the look of a man who appreciated the cold, clean, poetic lethality of the situation. "I see," he said again, but this time his voice was different. The professional detachment was gone, replaced by a tone of quiet, lethal partnership. "Well, that is unequivocal. The law is very clear on this. They have no legal right to the property. None whatsoever." He leaned forward, all business now. "We will serve them with a 30-day notice to vacate. It is ironclad. Any and all attempts at communication from them must be directed to this office. You will not speak to them. You will not answer their calls. You will not see them. We will be the wall between you and them. Are we clear?" "Perfectly," I said. He turned to his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. The quiet hum of the high-end laser printer in the corner of the room was the only sound. It was the sound of the wheels of justice beginning to turn. It was the sound of a promise being kept. As the lawyer printed the documents, the official eviction notice that would shatter my parents' perfect world, I felt a sense of power I hadn't felt in my entire life. It wasn't angry or hateful. It was calm. It was the quiet, unshakable power of a woman who had finally realized her own worth. We're getting to the best part of the story, so make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss the epic conclusion. 3 days passed. 3 days of absolute, deafening silence. No calls, no texts, no emails. It was the calm before the storm, and I used it to gird myself for the final act. On Saturday morning, I knew it was time. I looked at the calendar. It was my brother's weekend to bring the golden grandchild for their customary day of worship at the feet of my parents. The whole cast would be assembled. Perfect. I didn't dress for a fight. I dressed for a business meeting. A simple, professional blouse, a pair of dark trousers, and shoes that made no sound when I walked. I was not coming here as a daughter seeking a confrontation. I was a landlord serving a legal notice. In the passenger seat beside me sat a single, thick, 9x12 envelope of crisp white paper. It felt as heavy as a gravestone. The drive was surreal. The familiar streets of my childhood looked different, sharper, as if a film had been lifted from my eyes. I wasn't driving toward a place of painful memories. I was driving toward an asset, a piece of real estate. As I turned onto Maple Lane, I saw my brother's gleaming black luxury SUV in the driveway, parked right next to my father's sedan. The stage was set. I didn't park on the street. I pulled my modest, reliable car right up the driveway and parked behind them, blocking them in. A small, symbolic act. You are not leaving until this is done. Through the large bay window, I could see them all. The perfect family, frozen in a perfect moment. My father was at the head of the dining table laughing. My mother was serving from a platter. My brother, his wife, and their child were all smiling, bathed in the warm morning light. A picture of happiness, as fragile and as thin as glass. I walked to the front door, the heavy oak door that had been slammed shut on my children's future, and I didn't knock. I reached into my purse, pulled out the key my grandmother had given me 10 years ago, slid it into the lock, and turned. The sound of the tumblers clicking open was louder than a scream. I stepped inside. The laughter from the dining room died in an instant, replaced by a shocked, brittle silence. For heads turned towards me. My mother was the first to speak, her face a mask of outrage and disbelief. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" she gasped, placing a hand on her chest. "We told you this was a sanctuary. You are not welcome here." My father stood up, his face darkening with anger. "I thought we made ourselves perfectly clear. You need to leave. Now." My brother just smirked, leaning back in his chair with an infuriating smugness, as if he was about to watch his favorite show, the one where I get put back in my place. I ignored them all. My eyes were fixed on my father. I walked calmly, deliberately across the pristine beige carpet, the scene of the crime, my footsteps utterly silent. I didn't look at the shrine on the wall. I didn't look at the expensive furniture. I looked at the man who thought he was the king of this castle. I stopped in front of him and held out the white envelope. "As the owner of this property," I said, my voice resonating with a calm, clear power that silenced the entire room, "I'm giving you 30 days' notice to vacate." The silence that followed was absolute. Then it was broken by a bark of laughter from my father. It was a loud, scoffing, incredulous sound. "The owner!" he roared, looking at my brother for backup. "Have you finally lost your mind? The stress has gotten to you." My mother rushed to his side. "Honey, what is this nonsense? Are you on medication? What have you done?" My brother just shook his head, a pitying smile on his face. "This is sad," he said. "Truly pathetic." My father, still chuckling, snatched the envelope from my hand. "Let's see what kind of fantasy you've cooked up in that head of yours," he sneered, tearing it open with theatrical contempt. And then I watched it happen, the slow-motion destruction of their world. I watched my father's eyes scan the first page, the official legal letterhead from the most powerful real estate litigator in the city. The chuckle died in his throat. His eyes moved to the second document, the certified copy of the property deed. I saw the exact moment he saw my name. The arrogance on his face didn't just fade, it shattered. The color drained from his skin, leaving behind a pasty, gray pallor. His jaw went slack. The papers trembled in his hand. What is this?" he stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. My mother, sensing the shift, grabbed the papers from him. Her eyes flew across the page, her perfectly painted lips moving silently. Her confusion morphed into a high-pitched, panicked squeal. "This is fake!" she shrieked, looking at me with wild eyes. "This is a forgery. You horrible, vindictive child. What have you done?" That's when my brother, the fixer, finally stood up. The smugness was gone, replaced by a cold, reptilian fury. He strode over, snatched the deed from his mother's hand, and his face, for the first time in his life, showed a flicker of genuine fear. He looked from the paper to me, his mind clearly racing, trying to find an angle, a way to regain control. "What the hell is this?" he snarled, taking a step towards me. "You think you can just come in here with some fake papers and—" "Your voice doesn't matter here," I said, cutting him off with 2 Arctic cold sentences. The sound of my own voice surprised me with its strength. "You're just a guest. Your enabling of their cruelty is over." He stopped dead, stunned into silence. I had just dismissed him, the golden child, the center of their universe, as nothing more than an irrelevant guest. With all of them reeling, I finally let the last 30 years of pain speak. Not in a scream, but in a low, clear, and unshakable monologue. "For my entire life," I began, my gaze sweeping over all of them, "I have lived by your rules. I have accepted the scraps of affection you threw my way while you feasted on him. I watched you build a shrine to his child while mine were relegated to the basement. I swallowed the insults, I endured the neglect. I accepted my place as the simple one, the lesser one. I did it all in the foolish hope that one day you would see me. That one day you would see my children." I took a breath, my voice gaining strength. "But last week, you didn't just neglect them. You hurt them. You threw them out of this house like they were trash for the crime of being children. You stood on that porch and you broke their hearts. And in doing so, you broke the final thread of obligation I ever had to you." I looked my father dead in the eyes. "You called this house a sanctuary. You were right. It is. It was a sanctuary my grandmother created for me and for my children, to protect us from the day she knew would come. The day your cruelty finally became unbearable." I turned my gaze to my mother. You called my children destructive. You are the only destructive thing in this family. You have destroyed any chance of love, of respect, of ever knowing your own grandchildren. My voice dropped to a final, quiet, and irrevocable conclusion. My children are not welcome in this house. Therefore, you are not welcome in my house. My lawyer will handle all further communication. And with that, I turned my back. I didn't wait for the screaming, the begging, the threats that I knew were coming. I walked out of the room, leaving a mushroom cloud of chaos and shattered arrogance in my wake. I stepped out into the bright sunshine, got into my car, and as I pulled out of the driveway, I saw them in my rearview mirror, a blurry portrait of panic and disbelief, trapped in a house that was no longer theirs. And for the first time in my entire life, I felt truly, completely, and gloriously free. The drive away from 128 Maple Lane was the first breath of the rest of my life. I didn't speed away. I drove at a calm, steady pace, leaving the chaos to shrink in my rearview mirror until it was nothing more than a bad memory. I expected to feel a storm of emotions, elation, or maybe even a pang of regret. But what I felt was a profound and wonderful emptiness. The space in my head that had been occupied by their judgment, their expectations, and my own desperate hope for 30 years was suddenly, blissfully silent. Of course, the silence didn't last long. By the time I was halfway home, my phone began to vibrate. It was my brother. I let it go to voicemail. A second later, it vibrated again, and again, and again. Then the text started, a machine gun burst of notifications, each one filled with impotent rage. When I finally got home and listened to the voicemails, it was like listening to the predictable 5-stage meltdown of a tyrant who has just been overthrown. The first message from my brother was pure, unfiltered fury. He threatened lawsuits. He called me every name he could think of. He promised he would ruin me, that I had no idea who I was messing with. It was the blustering of a man who had never been told no in his life, and the sound of it made me feel nothing but a distant pity. Then came the messages from my mother. They were a masterclass in emotional manipulation. The first was a shrieking, hysterical tirade, accusing me of trying to kill my father, who apparently had a weak heart. The next was a tearful, whimpering performance, begging me to remember all the sacrifices she had made for me, conveniently forgetting that every sacrifice came with a mountain of emotional debt. She tried to weaponize my own children, claiming they would be devastated to lose their grandparents. A gaslighting attempt so audacious it was almost impressive. My father was silent for the longest time. His pride, I imagine, was too wounded to allow him to act. But by the next day his voicemails started, too. They weren't angry or hysterical. They were pathetic. His voice was weak, pleading. He talked about family honor, about what the neighbors would think. He tried to invoke the memory of my grandmother, twisting her legacy into a tool for his own benefit. "Your grandmother would be ashamed of you," he said, a statement so profoundly wrong it actually made me laugh out loud. My grandmother would have been cheering me on. I listened to each message once, forwarded the files to Mr. Davies with a simple note that said, "For your records," and then I blocked their numbers. All of them. With each tap of the screen, another chain broke. I was not a participant in their drama anymore. I was an observer, and I was quickly losing interest in the show. The next 30 days were a masterclass in efficiency. My brother, true to his word, hired a high-powered lawyer who sent a blustering, threatening letter to Mr. Davies. Mr. Davies responded with a one-sentence email containing a scanned, certified copy of the deed and a note that said, "My client's position is final." We never heard from my brother's lawyer again. The day the forced sale sign was hammered into the pristine front lawn of 128, Maple Lane was a beautiful, sunny afternoon. I drove by just to see it. The bold, red letters felt like a declaration of independence. That house, which had been a symbol of my family's dysfunction and my own feelings of inadequacy, was now just an asset, a number on a spreadsheet. Its power over me was gone. It sold in less than a week, for more than I could have ever imagined. The money that landed in my bank account wasn't just a number. It was freedom. It was a future. It was the physical manifestation of my grandmother's love and foresight. I didn't waste it. I paid off my modest debts. I hired a financial advisor, and I established 2 ironclad, untouchable trust funds for my children's education and future. Whatever they wanted to be, wherever they wanted to go, their path would be paved with opportunity, not obligation. It was the ultimate act of breaking the cycle. Their future would be funded by the very house their value had been denied in. The poetic justice was not lost on me. And then we went house hunting. We didn't look for sterile perfection. We looked for life. We found it in a beautiful, light-filled house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, with a massive, slightly overgrown backyard and a giant oak tree perfect for a swing. The kitchen was huge and open, designed for laughter and messy cooking projects. The living room had a real fireplace, and my children's bedrooms were big and bright, with huge windows that overlooked the garden. There was no basement with a lumpy pull-out sofa. This was a home, not a museum. This was our sanctuary. The last I heard, my parents and my brother had to pool their resources to rent a small, cramped townhouse in a less desirable part of town. Their perfect world had been shattered. Their social standing had taken a nosedive, and they were left with nothing but their own bitterness. I felt nothing about this news. No satisfaction, no pity, no anger. Just a quiet, peaceful indifference. They were ghosts from a life I no longer lived. Now, my life is filled with the sound of my children's laughter in the backyard. It's filled with the smell of baking cookies in our warm kitchen and the sight of their vibrant, beautiful artwork proudly framed and hung on every wall. We have created our own definition of family, one built on unconditional love, mutual respect, and the freedom to be exactly who we are. I learned the hardest and most valuable lesson of my life on that cold front porch. That true family isn't an obligation you are born into, but a sanctuary you build. And sometimes the most powerful, loving thing you can do is let go of the family that hurts you, to make space for the one that heals you. You have to choose yourself. And that's how I finally ended the cycle. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you want to see another tale of entitled people getting exactly what they deserve, check out the video on your screen now. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.